Hello, today on this episode of the Housing Sector Podcast, it is a recap. Top 10 things we've learned from the last 10 episodes, our first 10 episodes. So expect this to be a regular thing. Just giving a brief summary of some of the more salient points that we covered in previous podcasts. So without further ado, the top 10 from the last 10.
The Housing Sector Podcast. Top 10 from the first 10. From Episode 1, The Steve Hayes Situation.
So in Episode 1 of the Housing Sector Podcast, I explained why I had set up a Housing Sector Podcast, what was the purpose behind it. And the main reason for that was what I labelled the Steve Hayes situation. This is Green Square Accord's head of communications director, who is a self-proclaimed comms hero, who is often self-promoting himself. If he's not talking about how great he is at communicating, he's telling others how they should communicate. He is at award ceremony, judging, handing out awards, photobombing, whatever you want to call it. What he was doing to me personally was, as soon as it would be announced on LinkedIn that I would be appearing somewhere, talking somewhere, Chartered Institute of Housing, or I'd be sharing a blog with someone, he would come in and close it down and say, "You can't use him, there's legal action pending." We call this the Steve Hayes situation. And how did Green Square Accord and Steve Hayes respond to this? Well, they contacted YouTube and said, "You can't have this content on there. It's hate speech. It's breaches copyright." There were all sorts of reasons why this had to be removed. And YouTube would take the content down. They would then investigate it. After I said, "Well, why have you taken this down?" They would do an investigation and they would reinstate it. And this went on 3 or 4 times. Every time it did, I would put it back on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook and say the post that they tried to censor is now back on, and traffic went up and up and up. So they haven't tried that again since, although perhaps they will with this one. Either way, the reason we started podcasting was called the Steve Hayes situation. If you want to see this video for yourself, it has been taken off of YouTube because I can't be bothered to keep fighting it. However, on the Green Square Accord residence website, it can be found under the title The Steve Hayes Situation, and of course it can be found on the Housing Sector Podcast page where all our podcasts are. That was Episode 1, The Steve Hayes Situation.
From Episode 2, The Need for Investigatory Questions.
In Episode 2, we asked, why aren't the customer service desks able to ask the correct questions, investigatory questions, questions that will provide detail, that will furnish the repairs and building maintenance people with the information that they need to successfully carry out the task of repairing the issue. This is under the title of Block Pipes and Raw Sewage, and was again an issue with my own landlord, Green Square Accord, where we have internal pipes that have burst, that are leaking, sewage coming into people's homes, into the basement car park, and causing damp and mould throughout our communal areas. Some of these have been identified as residential leaks, but that first initial response that we had, it was a constant battle to get it raised seriously and to have the proper attention. And indeed, it took external influence from such of a load of councillors and MPs to come around and have a look at it. It took loading photographs up onto the internet so people could see for themselves the first-hand the leaks and the sewage and everything that was happening in visual. It needed videos, it needed photos before we got that proper response. And here we are, whatever it is, 8 weeks later, still ongoing. Residents are now getting their own devices so we can test for black mould because it's still not really been resolved. But that episode 2, Block Pipes and Raw Sewage, was all about asking, why don't we have the right questions asked? Why is it quickly dismissed and blamed on residents when actually it should be at the top of your list to come round and check what is causing damage to a building that you maintain? Why weren't the customer service desk trained well enough to ask questions that would garner and gain information that would be able to share at the next level so decisions could be smartly made? Doesn't happen. Still not happening. That was Episode 2.
From Episode 3, Superficially Proud.
In Episode 3, we looked at why many providers, not as many as previous years, were jumping on the LGBTQT June Pride Month and changing their logos so they were rainbow in colour. This was viewed by 75% of Britons who believed it to be nothing more than a superficial gesture that carried no real weight. Even members of the LGBTQT community, 55 of them saying it was just superficial, and again there wasn't actually any real progress being made in housing allocation and how they were dealt with by these organisations. So we looked at that, called people out for that, asked why is this still happening, and it was happening on the month where we had D-Day celebrations, yet there was no mention of that. No providers seemed to make any mention of the D-Day victory and the importance of that, the importance and the significance of that. And of course, the other anniversary in that month was 7 years from Grenfell. 72 lives lost, and providers didn't make any note of that. And what they should have done is come on and said, in the prevailing 7 years since Grenfell, we have removed so much cladding. We have improved our fire safety standards. We have made sure all our smoke detectors work. All our electrical wiring is safe. There was none of that. That's what we called out in episode 3.
From episode 4, focus on your day job.
In episode 4, we asked, why are our CEOs and senior leadership teams spreading themselves too thin? This was in response to more CEOs becoming members of other boards and sitting on other federations and advising councils and getting involved in things when failing in their day-to-day duties. Should they not be focused on the day-to-day task of running a housing association? And when they're failing, are they really in any position to be offering advice to other providers or other people within the sector or further sectors? We also asked why too many senior leaders are off gallivanting on all these constant events that they go to. If they're not here, there, everywhere, the one place they don't seem to be is in the office doing the job. So we called out for that. Are they spreading themselves too thin? What we need are our CEOs and our senior leadership teams focused on the day-to-day runnings of their own housing associations. They need to be fixing their own procedures. They need to be strengthening their own procedures. They need to be ensuring that residents are safe, warm and dry in their own homes. Once they've got that fixed, gallivant away. Until then, perhaps you need to refocus your attention. That was episode 4.
From episode 5, our first chat with Suze from SHAC.
In episode 5, we had our first housing sector interview with Suze Munner from SHAC. And when Suze and I get talking, we can talk. In this episode, we looked at this episode that was recorded pre-election, so before Labour had taken the reins of the country. We asked, why is there a lack of focus on fixing issues? There seems to be a bit of a push on the need for new builds, which has continued as Labour have got in. So there's this big push on needing new homes, but there seems to be very little focus on addressing the shortfallings of many housing providers and fixing the current stock. So it's all about new builds, less about fixing the issues that we've got. What are we doing by not focusing on the issues? We're allowing these housing providers to build more homes, but we're not shoring up the back office to make sure that they can manage these new homes that they build, which of course later lead to dilapidated stock, residents in unsafe homes, and selling off and breaking up of communities. That was episode 5.
From episode 6, the biggest scandal to hit the UK since the last one.
In episode 6, we asked, why are housing providers pushing back against negative criticism? Why are they reducing the amount of steps within their own complaints level? Why are they so closed-eared and blinkered when it comes to raising and addressing their own issues? Then we asked, well, perhaps this is part of a bigger scandal. Are housing providers taking advantage of all of the funding up front so they can build new homes, then charging an extortionate service charge for a lackluster service, and then when these homes inevitably fall into disrepair, when they're unsafe, when they have to be sold off, we're breaking up communities? Is this the biggest scandal to face the UK since the last big scandal being the post office one? Why aren't people talking about this? Why isn't it being addressed? Is it too much of a rush to build new homes? And are these so-called not-for-profit housing associations taking advantage of government initiative and government funding to build new homes, taking a dip out of the middle and then selling it off to their mates? Is it the big scandal? That was episode 6.
From episode 7, providers guilty of overcharging.
In episode 7, we asked, and looked into the amount of housing providers who have been found guilty of overcharging, either be it through service charge or rent or other fees that they could find. The list included One Housing, Clarion, Your Housing, Metropolitan Thames Housing, Peabody, Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, Southern Housing, Notting Hill, Genesis and Lambeth Council, with the latter, Lambeth Council, also making residents sign NDAs before giving them their refund. So we dare to ask, how many others are mischarging, unable to do their math correctly? Is it an error or is it corruption? Who knows? I suspect the list will keep on growing. That was episode 7.
From episode 8, The True Cost of Failure.
In episode 8, we had our second interview. This one was with Claire Southgate, a volunteer vicar, a teaching assistant, the hub of the community within Box, where she has lived for the past 20 years. Claire has been issued a notice through a letter one day on a letterbox, saying that she was to be evicted from her home in 20 years by her landlord, Green Square Accord, who say, well, they've given lots of different reasons to why she's the building's listed, the building's not safe, the building's damp, the building's too expensive to fix. Claire's quite happy living there and has been for the last 20 years. She says the kitchen could do with a little bit of an upgrade, but the rest of the home is fit for purpose. Green Square, in response to a BBC interview and pressure from Claire's counsellor, have then gone, oh, well, we'll try and keep you in the village, but at what cost? There are no other homes. It will mean forcing someone else out so Claire can remain in the village, something she's not happy to do. We call this the human cost, and this really is the human cost of the failure by providers to provide homes that remain safe, warm and dry, through a lack of response, repairs, the ability to manage their own stock. That was episode 8.
From episode 9, Suze from SHAC is back.
In episode 9, we had another interview with Suze from SHAC. In this one, we talked about the golden web that SHAC have been investigating. It's about how connected lots of these housing association CEOs are with different MPs who later go on to sit on boards. One name in particular was Gavin Barwell, who, whilst being housing minister, had gotten rid of a load of fire safety regulations that had been in place since the Great Fire of London in 1666, for those who did listen in their history lessons. So he got rid of a load of those, of course, in Grenfell, and now he sits on, or was sitting on, a board at Clarion Housing. Are these the sort of people that we want sitting on boards? I mean, all they're going to do is talk about the loopholes. There was also concerns raised about just how connected some other MPs are with housing associations that they may be in turn called to investigate at a later date. And is it too incestuous? It's called the Golden Web. You can find out more on the SHAC website. A link will be posted. That was episode 9.
From episode 10, The X Debate.
In episode 10, in response to Places for People, another housing provider celebrating the fact that they're coming off of X due to unsubstantiated reports of hatred that appears to be rife on there. Although I'm unable to find it in my feed because my feed tends to be focused on housing. We said, well, hang on a minute. If you're managing your own feeds, how are you protecting your residents and staff who supposedly are coming to you and saying they feel threatened by the platform X? And yet you're coming off it. Seems to be sort of running away from an issue and surrendering it to the right. We call out and say, actually, this is you managing your own online presence. It's nothing to do with residents. It's nothing to do with your customers or your staff who you allege are feeling threatened by data, information and stories that you allege are on there without providing any proof. You're actually doing it because it stops people complaining. So X is a platform where residents can respond to you. So when you post something good on there in a sort of attempt to manage your online reputation, they can put up there, no, you're rubbish. Here's damp, here's rats, here's this, here's that, here's fire safety issues. The real reason people are coming off of X has nothing to do with hate speech and everything to do with closing down a platform that entitles people to complain. It's another level that the housing providers are going to stop people from complaining. It has nothing to do with content that they find on there disagreeable. Virtue signalling at best, at worst, brand management. That was episode 10.
Final thoughts, thanks, and coming soon.
So that was the top 10 from the first 10 housing sector podcasts. Thank you to every one of you who has come along on this journey, who has offered support and guidance and advice. It's been insightful for me going back and watching over the first 10 to see how how the content is relevant, but it's the polish that we're adding to it. From me slurping lots of cups of tea without a microphone in the first few episodes, we're getting better, and it's a path that we're on. It's a journey we'll continue, and we will get better inevitably. Thank you to everyone who has contributed. It would be great to get a bit more contribution from the housing providers. This is a platform to bridge that gap between resident and provider. At the minute, I suspect they're not, because they don't see the need to, because we haven't got a big enough audience. But I assure you that audience is growing. In the next episode 11 of the Housing Sector podcast, we will be talking to someone who is involved in asset management and who has some insights and perhaps a tool that can really support the sector that will in turn support us residents. If you don't have a clear understanding of your stock, how can you hope to manage it? That's all coming up in episode 11. Thank you very much indeed. This is Ben signing off. Top 10 from the first 10.
Thank you for listening to the Housing Sector podcast. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends and colleagues. Your support helps us continue to bring you the latest updates and discussions on housing issues. Stay tuned for our next episode, and don't forget to follow us on our social media sites for more content and updates.